Hi, my name is Bryan Morrison. I'll be talking about To Reach Japan. So it starts off with a man named Peter setting off his family, his wife Greta, and his child Katie. It seems to be like a very loving husband and father. It then talks about how his mother escaped with him as a baby from Czechoslovakia to Western Europe and ended up leaving his father behind, who ended up dying. Then talks about how Peter's mother became a teacher and was a very serious woman. She didn't enjoy jokes. Jokes actually pained her, it states. Then talks about how Peter doesn't like to criticize things such as movies. He doesn't like to talk about movies afterward, which leads me to believe that he is not an open, opinionated person. He doesn't like to judge things. He thinks that who is he to judge other people's work? Then talks about how feminism wasn't very popular back then, was looked down upon. This was back during a time when women know their place was acceptable thought. It's an old fashioned time. Poetry was also deemed safer for women. I don't know if this was more of like it was viewed as feminist or women just had a better knack for it back then. Then talks about how Peter was going to have to leave for his engineering job to go more north in Canada, but it turns out that his family would not be accommodated, so they would have to be separated. Luckily, an old friend of Greta offered to have Greta and Katie come up to Toronto and house sit for them, and they ended up taking them up on the offer, which is how they get to the beginning where when they're leaving on the train. Greta is then invited to a party from for her poetry that was just published. She ends up going and getting all dressed up and ends up making her way to the party. She goes by public transportation while most other people were going by private cars. As she got closer, she was kind of hoping she got lost because it seems to me that she wasn't too excited about going to this party, and she was saying that she wouldn't be unhappy if she didn't find the street or she was on the wrong street. But she ends up finding the right street and ends up going to the party. She ends up being rudely invited in by another woman. Then she's in the party and tries to mingle, which ends in failure. Doesn't get too far with other guests, so she begins to drink. She then reflects on how different the parties are as, or how different poetry or writing parties are to engineering. While engineering parties are more laid back and more welcoming, everyone at the writing parties seems more uptight. This seems to me because engineering is more stable, while writing is more risky. So theoretically, everyone else that's a writer is competition, and so they like to keep their groups closed. She ends up getting sloppy drunk, and a man approaches her and offers to take her home. Take her home. She's hesitant, but ends up going with him. She then learns that this man is named Harris Bennett, and After she takes him home, or he takes her home, they start talking about their families, and which then leads to Harris stating that he decided he was going to kiss her, which leaves her craving it even more. She then begins to fantasize about this man, and even though she's married, she still does it, and she doesn't feel like it's right, but she can't help it. Even though there's nothing special about this man, she starts to feel this sense of melancholy about her mundane domestic life. And I think the reason she was into this guy is because it wasn't her husband. It was different. It was exciting to be with someone else. She then becomes slowly obsessed with this man and ends up sending a letter, which we then get a reference to the title. Then we cut back to the train where the train finally takes off and leaves behind Peter, and Katie starts to understand that Peter isn't coming. Greta then begins to read Christopher Robin, or Winnie the Pooh, to Katie, one of her favorite books, and then they're approached by two young believed students who then approach them and tell them that they're actors for preschoolers. At first, Katie wasn't a fan, wasn't happy with Greg at all. We then learned that Greg and Lori were a couple, but not anymore. They both then begin to do throat exercises and making odd noises, which Katie begins to like, and Katie starts to warm up to them. So Katie begins to trust these two, and then they go to the playroom.